Curtiss SB2C Helldiver. The year is 1943, and you are a Navy pilot standing on the windswept deck of a carrier in the middle of the Pacific. Your hands are accustomed to the legendary SBD Dauntless, a plane so incredibly reliable it felt like a natural extension of your own wings. Then, without warning, the Navy hands you the heavy keys to the Curtiss SB2C Helldiver. At first glance, the airframe looks imposing, but the moment you push the throttle up, you realize why every deckhand calls it the Beast. And it is certainly not a compliment. This massive dive bomber was so plagued with mechanical issues that frustrated pilots quickly rebranded the SB2C acronym to stand for SOB Second Class. The Helldiver was a textbook case of too much, too soon, sacrificing stability for raw size. It was nearly 3,000 pounds heavier than its predecessor, weighing in at a staggering 10,547 pounds when completely empty. To ensure it could fit onto cramped carrier elevators, Curtiss engineers shortened the fuselage, which inadvertently made the aircraft aerodynamically unstable. When you tried to line up a precision dive at 300 miles per hour, the tail would often buffet so violently that keeping your sights on a Japanese carrier felt like trying to thread a needle while riding a mechanical bull. The complex electrical system was another nightmare, frequently failing at the worst possible moments during combat. If your hydraulic flaps didn't retract symmetrically after a heavy strike, the plane would snap roll without warning, sending you spiraling into the ocean before you could even scream for help. Even Admiral J.J. Clark once threatened to cancel the entire program because the Helldiver's handling was so treacherous during carrier landings. It required a dangerously high landing speed of nearly 85 miles per hour, a high-stakes gamble on a pitching wooden deck that left no room for even a fractional human error. Martin B-26 Marauder. The Martin B-26 Marauder was an ambitious failure of early 1940s aeronautics that prioritized speed over basic pilot safety. On paper, it was a breakthrough, a medium bomber with a sleek, cigar-shaped fuselage capable of hit-and-run missions at a cruise speed of 285 miles per hour. This allowed it to outrun most interceptors of the era, but the technical cost was devastating. To achieve this velocity, engineers used an incredibly small wing area, resulting in a wing loading so high that the aircraft flew with the stability of a falling lead pipe. This design created a lethal problem during the most critical phases of flight, takeoff and landing. Unlike other bombers that offered a wide margin for error, the B-26 demanded absolute perfection. The most notorious metric was its approach speed, which had to be kept at a relentless 150 miles per hour just to maintain lift. If a pilot dropped even a few miles per hour below this threshold, the wings would instantly stall, causing the 7-ton machine to drop out of the sky like a dead weight. There was no warning and no chance for recovery, just a sudden vertical plunge. These unforgiving flight characteristics led to a brutal string of fatal accidents at training bases across the American Southeast. In the heavy, humid air of Florida, rookie pilots struggled to master the high-speed landings, resulting in so many fiery runway crashes that morale collapsed. The situation at MacDill Field became so predictable that crews coined a dark, rhythmic warning, "One a day in Tampa Bay," a direct reference to how often wreckage had to be hauled out of the local waters. Even after later models increased the wingspan by 6 feet to improve safety, the early crews remained scarred by the design. To them, the Marauder wasn't a weapon of war. It was a high-speed, technical gamble where one minor mistake led to a fiery, irreversible end. Mitsubishi A6M0. Japanese engineering in 1940 achieved a legendary status by making a radical, lethal choice. They bet everything on agility while completely abandoning pilot survival. The Mitsubishi Zero was an undisputed master of the turning fight, capable of outmaneuvering any American fighter in the early Pacific theater. But for the men in the cockpit, this world-class performance came at a terrifying price. To keep the aircraft at a featherweight 3,680 pounds, designers stripped away every fundamental safety feature required for modern air combat. In a move that turned the aircraft into a flying tinderbox, The Zero was built without a single inch of armor plating for the pilot and possessed absolutely no self-sealing capability in its fuel tanks. This meant the Zero was a one-hit wonder in the worst possible way. While it could dance around a Wildcat, it possessed no structural integrity to survive even a glancing blow. American pilots soon realized they didn't need to be better dogfighters. They just needed to land one solid burst. The second a few .50 caliber rounds punctured the wing roots, the unprotected fuel lines would atomize, transforming the graceful fighter into a roaring, high-speed blowtorch that incinerated the pilot almost instantly. By 1943, the Zero had become a source of bitter resentment for Japanese airmen. They were trapped in an airframe that refused to evolve while facing faster, armored American Hellcats. The psychological weight was crushing as elite crews watched their friends vanish in sudden, brilliant flashes of orange fire, knowing they were flying inside a beautiful, aerodynamic fuel tank with no shield between them and a fiery death. It was a masterpiece of aerodynamics, but a total betrayal of the men who flew it. Douglas TBD Devastator. The Douglas TBD Devastator was a floating death trap that the U.S. Navy should have stripped from its carrier decks long before the first bombs ever fell on Pearl Harbor. In 1937, its all-metal skin and folding wings were considered revolutionary, but by 1942, it was nothing more than a slow-motion target in a high-speed, lethal war. Pilots forced to take this machine into combat felt a cold, paralyzing sense of dread, knowing they were flying a heavy relic that was completely outclassed by the modern pace of the Pacific. It wasn't just an aging aircraft, it was a tactical liability that offered the brave crews almost no chance of successfully returning to their carriers after a strike. The actual performance during a torpedo run was staggering for all the wrong reasons. When hauling a massive 2,216-pound Mark 13 torpedo, the Devastator's airspeed dropped to a literal crawl. Maxing out at a combat speed of just 206 miles per hour, the TBD was so agonizingly slow that Japanese pilots treated it like primitive target practice rather than a legitimate aerial threat. This absolute lack of velocity meant that the required long, straight torpedo runs felt like a nightmare march toward a firing squad. This obsolescence reached a horrific climax during the pivotal Battle of Midway. Torpedo Squadron 8, VT-8, launched 15 Devastators against the Japanese fleet. Every single plane was swatted out of the sky by anti-aircraft fire and fighters, leaving Ensign George Gay as the sole survivor out of 30 men. The psychological horror for these crews was absolute as they climbed into cockpits knowing their aircraft possessed no ability to outrun or outmaneuver the enemy, effectively turning their mission into a documented suicide run. For those who survived the early war, the Devastator was remembered with a cold, bitter hatred, a machine that gave its crew nothing but a front-row seat to their own public destruction. Brewster F2A Buffalo. The Brewster F2A Buffalo remains one of the most tragic examples of a promising interceptor design ruined by bureaucratic indecision and catastrophic weight management. When it first took to the sky, it was a modern, agile fighter that showed genuine potential. However, by the time it reached the front lines of the U.S. Marine Corps, it had been weighed down by layers of additional armor, heavy radio equipment, and increased fuel capacity. This relentless accumulation of upgrades added over 1,000 pounds to the airframe, effectively stripping away the aircraft's maneuverability and leaving the Wright Cyclone engine struggling to lift what had become a bloated, unresponsive shell. The technical failures of the Buffalo manifested most violently during the extreme stress of combat operations. The landing gear, originally designed for a much lighter aircraft, became notoriously fragile under the increased weight of the modifications. Pilots frequently faced the terrifying prospect of their gear snapping like twigs upon touching the runway, leading to a constant state of anxiety that the simple act of returning to base might result in a fiery ground loop. Furthermore, the engine was prone to severe overheating in the sweltering tropical climates of the Pacific, often losing critical power at the exact moment a pilot needed it most to escape an enemy's sights. By the Battle of Midway, the Buffalo's reputation was beyond repair or redemption. Facing off against the superior Japanese Zero, the Marine pilots found themselves trapped in a machine they derisively nicknamed the Flying Coffin. They discovered that the Buffalo lacked both the vertical climb rate and the turning radius to survive even a brief encounter with more modern fighters. The frustration among the men reached a breaking point as they realized they were flying a dog, a machine so sluggish and outclassed that it essentially served as a death trap for the elite pilots assigned to fly it. It was a heartbreaking failure of engineering that forced brave men to fight with one hand tied behind their backs. Heinkel He 177 Greif. The Heinkel He 177 Greif was meant to be the Luftwaffe's premier heavy bomber, a great griffin, designed to rain destruction upon Allied targets from afar. On paper, its streamlined silhouette and massive power plants were revolutionary. However, the German High Command made a disastrous strategic demand. This four-engine aircraft had to be capable of steep dive bombing. To achieve the necessary aerodynamics for such maneuvers, engineers coupled two DB6-05 engines together in each wing to drive a single massive propeller. This double-engine configuration, DB6-06, turned the aircraft into a flying furnace, as the cramped engine bays allowed heat to build up until the oil and fuel lines inevitably ignited without warning. The Greif became more dangerous to its own crews than to the enemy. Pilots lived in a constant state of paranoia, watching their engine instruments with more focus than the sky, knowing a routine flight could transform into a vertical inferno in seconds. The cooling systems were woefully inadequate for the heat generated by the coupled engines, leading to frequent fires that were impossible to extinguish mid-flight. German crews gave the He 177 a chilling, well-earned nickname, Reichsfeuerzeug, or the Reichsleiter, a mocking tribute to the plane's tendency to burst into flames at the slightest provocation. Combat missions in the Greif were an exercise in high-stakes survival. Even when the engines weren't catching fire, the structural integrity of the aircraft was often compromised by the immense stress of dive bombing requirements it was never truly built to handle. The tragedy of the He 177 was the sheer waste of human life. Elite crews were lost not to Allied fighters, but to a design so fundamentally flawed it was essentially a weapon turned against its own masters. It remains a haunting monument to what happens when political ego overrides the basic laws of thermodynamics. Heinkel He 162 Salamander. By 1944, the Third Reich was crumbling, leading to the desperate Volksjäger, or People's Fighter Project. The result was the Heinkel He 162 Salamander, a jet designed to be built by unskilled labor using non-strategic materials. Because high-grade aluminum was scarce, engineers turned to common wood and industrial adhesives. This pivot to cheap manufacturing transformed the aircraft into a structural gamble. The glue used to bond the wooden wings, known as Tego film, was highly corrosive and sensitive to humidity, leading to catastrophic structural failures where the wings would literally disintegrate while flying at speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour. The design was as lethal to the pilot as it was to the airframe. Unlike modern jets, the BMW 003 turbojet engine was mounted directly on top of the fuselage, right behind the cockpit. This placement created a terrifying dilemma for anyone forced to bail out. Without a sophisticated ejection seat, a pilot attempting to jump from a crippled Salamander faced an almost certain death, as the powerful intake of the jet engine sat ready to vacuum the human body into its spinning turbine blades at thousands of revolutions per minute. Operating the HE 162 required a level of finesse that the People's Fighter concept, meant for teenage recruits with minimal training, simply ignored. It was a twitchy, unforgiving machine that demanded expert handling to avoid a fatal stall. The tragedy of the He 162 lies in its cold-blooded disregard for human life. It was a disposable weapon of war where the survival of the pilot was a secondary concern to the desperate need for a cheap interceptor. It remains one of history's most vivid examples of how desperation can strip away the basic morality of engineering. Messerschmitt Me 163 Komet. The Messerschmitt Me 163 Komet represents the absolute peak of aeronautical insanity in the Second World War. To intercept Allied bombers, German engineers built a rocket-powered point defense fighter that could climb to 30,000 feet in under 3 minutes. However, the price for this spectacular performance was a propulsion system fueled by two of the most volatile substances ever put in a fuel tank: T-Stoff and C-Stoff. This hypergolic mixture was so violently reactive that it ignited on contact, and worse, it was so corrosive that any leak in the cockpit would literally dissolve the pilot's flesh and bones within their flight suit before they could even land. The landing phase was arguably more dangerous than the combat itself. To save weight, the Komet lacked traditional landing gear and instead landed on a single, narrow, retractable skid. Approaching the runway at a blistering 135 miles per hour, pilots had to perform a high-speed balancing act on this skid. If the aircraft tipped over or hit a bump while even a tiny amount of residual fuel remained, the resulting shock would trigger a massive explosion, vaporizing the entire machine instantly. The Komet offered its pilots approximately 8 minutes of powered flight, followed by a silent, powerless glide back to Earth, during which they were vulnerable to any enemy fighter in the area. The psychological weight of flying the Komet was crushing, as pilots knew they were sitting on a ticking chemical time bomb that demanded total perfection at every second of the mission. It was a machine that defied the limits of human courage, asking men to strap themselves into a rocket that was often more interested in consuming its pilot than shooting down the enemy. If you found these stories of aviation nightmares fascinating, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden history of World War II. Which of these 8 death traps do you think was the absolute worst to fly? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next mission.